to threats and harassment in the home, we all lose out. We all lose out when top quality candidates won't throw their hat in the ring, because it's become so personally scary and threatening when people show up at your house with nooses and, threats arriving in your mail. So I think, I don't know. Again, I don't think it persuades anybody. I think it turns people off of the cause, but I think it strikes a much deeper blow at the success of our whole government going forward. And, I encountered that. I mean, there was a person I wanted to maybe serve as on our redistricting commission, and they wouldn't do it because they were afraid people were going to be showing at their house and threatening their family and kids. I mean, that's a fairly, lower level position. That's not exactly a super high profile governor thing. And I mean, we can't even find people to serve on a redistricting commission because they're so afraid of the threats that their family will be subject to. I think we might have a problem going forward in finding top quality public servants and potential public servants to throw their hat in.
Well, all the more reason why we're so glad that you both are here today and that you are willing to stick your necks out, because it's certainly a tough thing to do, more than people realize. So these are tough conversations. We want to segue into the public lands piece, because it can be very fraught, and it has been fraught. Both of you, what do you think is the most important issue facing Idahoans when it comes to the topic of public lands? In other words, why should the average Idahoan care about public lands? And Representative Rubel, we'll go ahead and start back up with you.
Sure. Well, I think everybody should be very, very interested in public lands issues, because I think it's Idaho's secret weapon. I think Cecil Landris once called it everybody's second paycheck. But I think it is so foundational to the success of our state and our economy, and certainly to people personally. I think many of the people on this call just know personally in their own lives that just being able to go out hunting and fishing and hiking and biking is a critical part of why they're happy living here. But I think from a bigger macroeconomic perspective, it is so pivotal. And I think it always gets undercounted. I mean, it's really why we have half the businesses here and why we're thriving, why we're growing. There was an Idaho Business for the Outdoors did a survey a few years ago of 125 Idaho businesses, and it was geographically distributed and by industry, and they found that 99% of them said that Idaho's outdoors are an important factor in recruiting employees, and a substantial portion felt that a reduction in public lands would really diminish their ability to recruit top talent. It's how we get people here. It brings in billions and billions of dollars a year. We bring in $3.7 billion in tourism a year, and they're not here to see the Mona Lisa or the Coliseum. They're here to see the trees and the rivers and the mountains. It's really how we're able to get top quality people here in every profession you can think of, people who can probably make 2 or 3 times as much somewhere else, but they're here because of our outdoors and our public lands. And we lose that. We lose, the secret weapon that makes us successful.
Representative Boyle, your take?
Public lands are always important, no matter where you live in the West, because we have a lot of them. We're very fortunate in Idaho. The part that I usually focus on is right now, all the fires going on. That is trees burning up, watersheds being destroyed, animals being burnt alive. That is a huge problem, has been for a long time. If we don't manage our land, this is what happens. Either Mother Nature manages it in a massive clear cut, or we manage it. So every one of those trees that burn up, just think of that as maybe thousands of dollar bills being burnt up, homes that can't be built, and clean water.
Well, thank you both for your take on that. And sorry if we're having a little bit of technical difficulty on the background. So if the pictures are a little slow to move back and forth, it looks like we might have missed some of that. So for those of you who are trying to watch online, if you can see it, great. And if you're watching this later, I apologize for the discontinuity. But moving right along, again, appreciate your answers on those questions. For Representative Boyle, first, the question that always lingers over the Idaho legislature, and we'd be remiss not to just take this question head on. Why are many rural communities frustrated with federal land management, and should Idaho take control of federally owned lands?
Well, I always use my little town of Council, Idaho. That used to be a very thriving community. Boise Cascade had a mill there. And Boise Cascade actually gave scholarships to all the employees' kids that wanted to go to college. It was a fantastic place for people to work. And because there was logging, there were all kinds of businesses in that town, tire stores, gas stations, hardware stores, feed stores. There were a million different things going on there. It was a very, very rich county, Adams County. And then once all the logging went away, so did all those businesses. And pretty soon the mill was gone and all the jobs. I personally am friends with a lot of those people who lost their jobs. Then dads had to go elsewhere to find a job. Their family had to stay home. There was nobody there to correct the third grade boy when he got in trouble, except a mom who was stressed out completely. It was very sad. And finally, a lot of the families had to move, ended up getting a divorce. It was awful. So I use that as my poster child as to why we need to take care of the rural communities, the rural economies, and have real management. Today, things are burnt. I don't think tourists really come here to see a burnt up forest and have smoke in their eyes all the time. And up there, we also have a lot of state land. Last year, it was burnt up because the fire started on the federal land and it wasn't controlled. It was finally the state that ended up putting that out. And then that costs our state taxpayers a lot of money. So there are ways we can take care of things. Our state lands are managed very, very well. People can drive through them and see beautiful forests, see animals. Our private lands are the same way. That is the problem that a lot of rural Idaho has, is not correct management and the results of it.
Yeah, real impacts for real lives. Thank you for that. And Representative Rubel, what's your take on how to manage public lands, the need for land to be used for industry, and the relation between federal land managers and local communities?
Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind that these lands are really managed for the benefit of all Americans. So it's really important that all sides can and should have a voice. I think Idaho has actually really been very successful in this regard in terms of the expanded success of collaborative efforts across industry and all these different groups, counties, conservationists, tribes, wildlife advocates, state agencies, timber interests, ranching interests. And they've really succeeded in providing a forum for civility and a productive dialogue for public lands, which have led to some really great achievements. They've, in Owyhee County, they help provide for new wilderness and wild rivers. They've also provided certainty for ranchers and investments for local interests. There have been some successes in terms of prescribed fire and thinning to reduce the fire risk that Representative Boyle was talking about. They've been successful in restoring streams. I think you can look around the state and find many really productive examples of collaborative efforts to reach these win-win outcomes in terms of optimal treatment of public lands. And I think that is really the direction I think we need to go in. But I certainly would like to see these lands remain public to the greatest extent possible.
Great. Well, let's dive in just a little bit more. And one of the things I love about this series is an opportunity to learn some things. As you noted, Representative Boyle, we come from different parts of the state, and though my family has rural roots from the Burley area, I'm Boise born and raised. So I'm really interested to learn more about the Good Neighbor Authority. Can you explain a little bit more about that and your thoughts on the future for the program in Idaho?
Yeah, that is a fantastic program. Idaho was one of the very first states to go forward with that Good Neighbor Authority. And our state lands our lands department, they can maneuver things a lot faster than the federal government. The federal government has so many rules. They're always tied up in knots, it seems like. The state land department can just do things a lot faster, easier, get things done. So we have actually come to the point where our state land department can help with the EISs. They can go out and cruise the timber to see exactly what's there. And this is on federal land, but the state is taking a management role in it. And we've had numerous projects which have raised a lot of money for both the state and the federal government. We have cleaned up the forest tremendously, cut a lot of old trees that should have been taken care of instead of just waiting for a match or a lightning strike to take them away. So it is a very, very good, effective program. Unfortunately, now we're starting into the lawsuit phases on those, which I'm very sad to see. That is what happened to the federal lands, was lawsuits constantly, and then it just became paralyzed. A lot of the federal managers gave up because they knew no matter what they did, they were going to face a lawsuit and keep them in court until the time to do anything was gone. And all was left was dead trees to burn up. So the Good Neighbor Authority is excellent. I'm very happy that Idaho's involved in it. It's been a really, really good relationship with the federal government and the state. And then we also have shared stewardship. That is another project with the federal government, the state government, and private landowners. And we have two large areas, one in North Idaho, one in Southern Idaho, that we're trying to work together to see how we can protect land by managing it, getting rid of overgrown trees, diseased trees, and just take care of things.
So, Representative Boyle, if you could, you've touched on this some, but I'd love to hear more about your perspective on fire suppression and public lands and ways that we can improve that work.
All right. Well, fire suppression starts with a managed forest or managed rangeland. When things are overgrown, that is when we have a large problem. The trees begin dying. Think of this: if you had 100 people and they were all crowded into a 100 square foot room, no one could breathe. Everybody would be in panic mode. That's how the trees feel. They cannot get nutrients, water, sunlight, and then they can't grow and they end up dying or becoming very, very weak. The bugs then move in, disease sets in, and then you have a forest ripe for a fire. We have started a really cool thing, I think, a few years ago, and it is in the desert part of Idaho, where BLM is. So Owyhee County was one of the first ones that did this, Owyhee and Elmore, and it's the Rangeland Fire Protection Associations. And those are the first responders when there is a fire. Mostly they're the ranchers because they're out there. They'll see a lightning strike somewhere and they will be right there to put it out. It didn't used to be that way. It used to be they had to call into the BLM. BLM then had to find people to come find out what's going on. They had to study it. Pretty soon it's a huge fire, where these guys are able to put out fires pretty instantly. And that was modeled after Northern Idaho. So in North Idaho, we have 2 fire protection districts, which have done the same thing for, well, I think one of them is 100 years old. Luke's probably familiar with those. And they work with private property and the state lands, do a fantastic job, put out a lot of fires instantly. Their goal is put out the fire before it gets to 10 acres, and they do that 94% of the time.
Thank you very much, Representative Boyle. And Representative Rubel, as Idaho has been discovered, the increasing population has had a lot of impact on all of our lives. Including the willingness of private landowners to allow access, shared use between non-motorized recreation and motorized recreation. It's had an impact on industries like timber and agriculture, and obviously infringement on private land. Can you share your thoughts on what increasing population means for land use in Idaho?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a pretty significant concern. We are, I think, the fastest growing state. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I think a lot of those people are coming here because they want to go, enjoy the outdoors. So this is creating enormous pressures on our public lands and waters. And we are already seeing it, and I think we're going to see more of it. And actually, I think COVID caused that to amp up even more because, everybody wanted to come here because it was a place where they could actually be outdoors. And that was one of the few things people could do to get out of their house is go find a trail. And in fact, we had to put in substantially more money this year into our state Department of Parks because of such overutilization of our public lands. But I do think it's really important that we educate these incoming people on public land use and civility and responsibility, and how they can and should be using these lands in a way that doesn't trigger backlash, and that they're not abusing private property insofar as it abuts that. I think another thing that we're seeing right now that's causing tension, I think there are actually a few dynamics. One is there were many lands that people kind of treated as public, but they really weren't public for many, many years. Lands that were owned by Potlatch and lands that were owned by, Boise Cascade, where, they didn't really care if people went on there and hunted, and, people were kind of used to recreating there for many years. And then those got sold to private landowners who don't want anybody there. So I think that was a bit of a shock to the system for many recreators, and that is what it is. You can't trespass on private land. But what I think really does need to be resolved is now that nobody can set foot on that land anymore, it's having the effect of blocking access to actual public land. That might be on the other side of that private strip. So we're seeing, real blockages to substantial amounts of public land as we see, these lands that were private, but that technically that for many years people had been allowed to traverse. So I think we need to find a resolution to that, whether it's through negotiated easements or something, because right now, a lot of people are very unhappy at their loss of access to public lands as the fences have gone up on those private lands. And I think we also need to negotiate and find a solution to this endowment land thing, which really came to a head in Payette recently on Payette Lake, where we have endowment lands that people have been enjoying and recreating on as if they were parklands, but the rules are very different for endowment land. They have to be revenue producing. And I think it's kind of going to be a shock to the system of a lot of Idahoans when they realize this land they've been hiking and enjoying and fishing, can be pulled out from under them at any time as there's pressure to make it more profitable. So I think some longer term solutions are going to have to be arrived at for those areas that have really, really high recreational value. We're going to have to find a way to characterize them and transfer them, or maybe trade in a manner that perhaps they won't be endowment lands anymore and they'll have to be traded. But I think as we see this growth, people are going to find that the lands that they have relied on recreating on may be snatched out from under them.
If it's okay, Diana, I'm going to go a little bit off script and let Representative Boyle respond to that as well, because I think that's an important aspect for her to talk about as well, with the endowment lands in particular.
Well, the new people that come, they don't know the difference between private land, endowment land, and federal land at all. So it is really important that they understand that somehow. They do need to be respectful, and we have a lot of problems with that. As soon as you leave Boise, people think it's all federal land and they can just go wherever they want. So it takes a great deal of education. As for the endowment lands, I would love to see more endowment lands and less federal lands, honestly. As long as those endowment lands were made multiple use. I had a bill a few years ago that any land that came into not the endowment, but came into the state would not be treated like endowment lands, but would be treated as multiple use land, which the federal lands are supposed to be. So sharing trails, that's really important to teach people. It doesn't matter if you're on a bike, a horse, a motorcycle, be respectful and share. Your use isn't more important than anybody else's. And I'm actually glad that the endowment decided that they were not going to trade that land around Payette Lake. I don't think that was a good deal for the endowment at all.
Very contentious issue for sure.
very much.
Yeah. Sorry, Diana, I just wanted to go off script there to give Representative Boyle a...
Well, I think, let's just sort of pick up on that because it's a really tricky situation, obviously, because our endowment lands, there's some statehood and they're there to really maximize returns to benefit a number of really important elements in our society, especially education. Do you see there needing to be some sort of legislative or constitutional fix? Or are we just going to keep kind of running up against this issue with various proposals to maximize the return from those lands?
Oh, who was that directed to?
Go for it, Ilana.
Okay. Yeah, I think we should take a hard look at that. And I know that's something Colorado and maybe other states have done. Because it's a tricky, I understand that their mandate is that they have to maximize the revenues on the land when it is endowment land, but it becomes a tricky question. And I think we might be chronically undervaluing it because, for example, if you have a patch of, very popular recreational land that is, making surgeons want to move here to work at St. Luke's and St. L so they can spend their weekends there, and it's making engineers want to come to Micron so that they can take their families there. I mean, it might be having vast economic benefit to the state that is not being captured merely by the amount of boards you're selling from the lumber on that land. And I understand it's a much harder thing to quantify, to look at that much bigger economic impact that it's having on the economy as a whole. But the fact that it's harder to quantify, it's very easy to quantify how much lumber you sold per acre on a chunk of land. You can bottom out on a number that easily on that. And you can probably bottom out on a number of like that dollar versus what does a private developer want to pay for that land. And sure, you have hard numbers that you can look at and compare one to the other, but that doesn't mean it's the right number, because if there's also, $200 million of value you're getting in terms of, drawing tourism to the state, drawing a highly educated workforce to the state by virtue of that land being there and being publicly available, you should count that. You're not getting the right number if you're not counting that economic impact that land is having by virtue of being publicly accessible and providing those assets and those benefits to the state. And so I think in order to be economically accurate, I think we should be making some effort to weigh all of the economic benefit of whatever use. And maybe at the end of the day, maybe it is worth more in the hands of a private developer by the time you take every factor into account. But in order to come up with the right decision on that, you should be taking every factor into account, which I think is not something that our current formula is designed to do. You're right, it might require a constitutional amendment based on Supreme Court precedent to be able to take everything into account. But I think we should get the right answer rather than the easy answer.
If I'm paraphrasing what you're saying, it's what is the value of a huckleberry patch? And for many of us, if we have our secret stash where we know we get huckleberries, it's invaluable, and I'm not telling you where mine is.
But I'm saying it might be worth more than the per pound amount of huckleberries that you sell for at the store, is my point, I guess.
It's a Lachiondo family secret, so there it is.
Yeah, exactly. The value of a huckleberry patch depends on how many other people know about it, right?
Exactly.
So how good of a pie maker you are, too.
Yeah.
But I think what you really touched on, and this is why this is such a important and touchy subject, because I think it's so core to who we are as Idahoans, and we're having to sort of grapple with it in a way that we haven't as much in the past because we're growing so rapidly, and and it has become very, very fraught in that way. What do you all? I'm just kind of picking up here, Luke, and we'll keep going. Do you see public lands coming up in this next legislative session, and what types of issues do you think that the legislature may take up? And I'll take that to Representative Boyle.
Well, there's always land issues, water issues, something. Department of Lands, I understand they're going to come and ask for more money for more firefighters, which they definitely need, and to pay them better. our firefighters aren't paid nearly what the federal ones are, and they do a fantastic job. So that will be one thing that definitely will come up. But water, timber, access, everything's always out there every session.
And you, Representative Rubel, what are some hot topics as it relates to public lands you envision coming up this year?
Yeah, I think Representative Boyle nailed it there with the fire issue. I mean, it's a disaster, for those of us who have to agonize every single day over whether we should send our kid to their sports with the 151 AQI. I mean, it's just terrible. I hope I'm not giving my kids lung cancer by trying to get them involved in high school sports, but it's bad. And Representative Boyle is right. It's the pay that's the issue. Just yesterday, President Biden was at NIFC, and the fire folks were talking about, they said their pressure isn't really so much on equipment. It's really about pay, and just getting enough pay to retain the people they have and getting enough pay to be able to recruit more. So I think something needs to be done about the pay scale there and the amount that we're putting into our firefighting resources on a staff level. I think that's a really big deal, and we have to tackle that. I'm not sure whether this whole kerfuffle with the pay at endowment lands, whether that will lead to it. I don't have any legislation planned on that front, but potentially someone else might. I know that there was a very angry party who's suing now over it, and sometimes these lawsuits can ripen into some kind of proposed legislation. I haven't seen anything yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if something came down the pike that way. And then I know that there's, we'll have to see what happens with all of the budget money that's being debated in Congress right now. I know that a fair amount of, the proposed 3.5 trillion budget, which may never come to fruition and get voted on. But I think a fair bit of that is, or some substantial amount has been earmarked for climate change mitigation. And so if any of that is in play, certainly I would imagine Idaho as an area with so much public land, so much potential carbon sequestration potential, but also so much burn potential, might have an important role in whatever happens there. So we'll have to see if money's coming our way that's addressed to those needs. But I think that if so, maybe there'll be something legislatively in terms of how that should be allocated.
I want to circle back on one more question before we wrap up, and that is Representative Boyle. We talked a little bit earlier about the disappearing access to private land because of population growth, among other things. But do you see land trusts or conservation easements as a viable solution to that moving forward in the future, and perhaps? We're hearing a lot about agricultural conservation easements as well, where ag land can be held into perpetuity for ag purposes, and allow families to be working that land with conservation easement on it. What's your view on the future of those programs for the state of Idaho?
Well, that's an individual choice for the landowner to make. What I have wanted to do for many years is something that California did in 1964, and it's called the Williamson Act. And that act, farmers and ranchers, you had to have 100 acres or more. You could sign up, and it was a contract for 10 years that you would not change your land. You would keep it in agriculture. You wouldn't develop it. And in exchange, then you would not pay property tax. There were some other things that you could have as a benefit. And that kept open spaces. It kept land in agriculture. And it has worked really well for them down there. We've never had money to try it up here. But that is something that the Farm Bureau is looking at and very, very interested in.
Thank you very much. And do you have any comments you want to wrap up with in regards to public land before we end it up?
I just want people to please don't go out and leave your campfire burning while you're out during hunting season this year. And don't throw garbage around. My kids, my 4-Hers, and my own kids, we would always, when we went anywhere, took garbage bags and we would clean up other people's garbage. That is ridiculous. Clean up your own garbage. Thank you.
Great public service announcement. Thank you very much. Can't echo it enough. Usually the fires are out by September 15th and we still see smoke everywhere. It's very frustrating. So how about you, Representative Rubel, before we wrap up? Any?
Well, it's hard to disagree with what Judy just said. Absolutely. People need to be careful and not have exploding gender reveal parties in the middle of a dry patch of sagebrush, etc. But I think people need to look after the things they love and not take them for granted. And I think we all love our public lands very much and very much value our access to them. And I think it's something that's going to need to be watched, and I think the public is going to need to be ready to engage because as I said, we had this wake-up call with the Payette situation where we have people think that these public lands are just there and they're going to be there forever. But there are different flavors of public lands, and some of these endowment lands and others, it could be snatched out from under the public at any time. And they better be ready to politically engage to find a solution if they find that their favorite patch of land where they've been going for decades is suddenly on the chopping block. So that would be my advice to everybody is be civically engaged and ready to act to protect what you love.
Great. Well, thank you both very much. Obviously, thank you to my co-host as well, Representative Boyle, Representative Rubel. Appreciate the conversation today. I also want to say thank you to our sponsors, our presenting sponsors, Dawson Taylor and Idaho Central Credit Union, our sponsors, Power Engineers and Ørsted Architects, and of course our media partners, Idaho Ed News, the Idaho Statesman, and the Idaho Press Tribune. We'll be back again next month with another episode of In Search of Civility. Thank you again for all of you who tuned in, and thanks again to our guests. Have a wonderful day. We are still live here, so give me just a second.